going over specifically anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism as a concept in international cooperation, and really trying to contextualize its impacts and consequences while making sure that we are making space and understanding what resistance can look like, what it has looked like, and the need to highlight and celebrate it, and then what that looks like in strategies for transformative change. It's always important, and before we get into the conversation, I think it's always really important for us to know what your personal objectives were coming to the session. So as you're introducing yourselves in the chat, feel free to also add what brought you to the session today, what you were looking forward to learning about or hearing about or asking questions about. Something I will also add is obviously, and as you may have heard before, the Black community is not a monolith. There is a huge diversity of perspectives, of experiences, of questionings, of identities, of intersectionalities, of histories, of traditions, of religions, of spiritualities that exist in our community that affect the ways in which Blackness needs to be understood in different contexts, in different aspects of our communities and for different purposes and goals. And so as we go through this presentation, I hope that we can stay grounded in the fact that this is through my studies, through my experience, through my community work, through my work in this sector, is what I have to offer, having obviously brought in my understandings and conversations with other experts, other folks who work in communities, other folks who work in academia, elders, community members. And so it's a presentation that exists amongst a sea of presentations, resources, conversations that exist on this topic. And it's always really important for us to be doing as much as we can to diversify our access to these conversations and this knowledge. And to remember that, especially as a sector that works very often directly with different communities, that it's really important for us to be very grounded in the experiences, the realities, the needs, the perspectives, the opinions of the communities that we're directly working with in conversation and in community with when it comes to these topics. So wanting to start off with a land honoring. So I think it's always important with land honorings, land acknowledgements, that we remember, especially as we are trying to, throughout the years, make them a larger practice in how we come together and how we learn and how we work, that land honorings and land acknowledgements aren't just things that you read out. They're not just like a checkbox exercise that you do when you have to speak in front of a group of people. The real backing to a land honoring is like a real reflection to the commitment that we have to Indigenous communities as people who have the privilege to live on these lands. And I think with this conversation, there are a lot of complexities to the relationship between our communities and the complicity and the collaboration and the ways in which our communities have met throughout the years. As a Canadian sector, I think it's always really important for us to be showing up for Indigenous communities and aligning our fights, our work, our goals, and really wanting to amplify and truly ground ourselves in the calls for re-indigenization of communities across the land that we're on, across Turtle Island. And as a sector that works globally, it's really important for us to recognize that we also exist and work on other Indigenous communities' lands, and that requires an accountability, a responsibility, really active participation, learning, and relationship building. And so just remembering that, again, much like the Black community, the Indigenous community is expansive and is a community and are communities that we owe a lot to across the world. And so when we are acknowledging them, I think it's always really important to remember that what they've always asked us to acknowledge is not only in what they have, they want us to learn and know and unlearn, but also the ways in which they're calling us to act, to change, to move the needle further and further along towards decolonial futures. Personally, I honor the land traditionally known as Jukjake, the island that has been a site of so much movement and connection, which has also been a grounding space for the transit of many Indigenous communities and traditional forms of connection, exchange, and collaboration. I honor the Ganigahaka Nation, the custodians of the land and water we live, work, love, and grow on. And I think that as someone that comes from two communities, so on my mom's side, I come from the Zarma, and from my dad's side, I come from the Bamike Bazou. I think that it's always really heartwarming. I think it really feeds a lot of my liberation practices and my beliefs in liberation to think of how our communities could have worked together, could have come together, could have known each other without colonization as kind of an interruption in how we exist as Indigenous communities and how we came together pre-colonization. Again, I love a good question. I love for us to always be questioning ourselves, questioning each other. So these are just a few simple questions to sometimes just ask ourselves when we're thinking about land honorings. I feel like often the one that the way and one that I'm grounded in land honorings is really how do you honor the Indigenous communities that are custodians, that are the folks who are trying to return to the land that you live on, or live more in connection and more freely on their land. So yeah, I think it's always important for us to be asking ourselves, what are we doing? What more can we be doing? And are we aligned with Indigenous communities and the work that they're calling us to do? So at the ARC Hub, anytime we come together, we do community agreements and community assumptions. In future presentations, you'll probably receive these before the presentation, but we like to also do them together just for the opportunity to kind of, if needed, have conversations about them. If folks want to ask questions, or if there are things that folks want to add, change. So community agreements, the idea is that we are agreeing to certain ways of engaging with each other in this space. They're called community agreements, community assumptions, because we are operating off of the understanding that we are coming together in this space as a community quickly built together under one specific purpose. And knowing that we come from different backgrounds, identities, experiences, needs, wants, so many different pieces of who we are and how we show up in spaces. So a lot of the time in spaces like this, we don't have the time to be going through the processes that build healthy and functional communities that sometimes take years. And so with this, we're trying to, as much as possible, create a safer space and align with each other in a way that allows us to engage with as much autonomy to create as much safety and possibility for engagement between each other. So with the community agreements, we start off with number one, we trust you to do what you need to do to ensure your full participation and that you will communicate your needs as they change. We commit to participating with a spirit of openness to learning. Number two, we are committed to building a safer space, prioritizing confidentiality, equitable participation, honesty, ownership over our words and actions. And number three, we are coming here open-minded, intending to be respectful and accountable. We will call out harmful behavior as it comes. And so like to always give a few moments to see if anyone has any questions, things they want to add, remove. I can't see the chat, so Megan, if there is anything, just let me know, please. Or feel free, anyone, to unmute yourselves and contribute out loud. It's looking like we're all good. So for the community assumptions, same nature. This is something that exists across between us as an agreement. We move through the world on a day-to-day with making a million assumptions And we all know what they say about assumptions, but it is also just the natural way of how we engage with each other, not always getting the chance to know each other deeply or deeper than these quick moments. And so with community assumptions, these are just some things that we are assuming to be true, assuming to exist as fact in our opportunity here to engage with each other in this session. And so we start off with opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary. We live at intersections. We all benefit and are harmed by systematic oppression, even if in different ways. An individual and/or a community is the expert of their own experience and the solutions to the problems they face. Dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. All systems of oppression exist and are interconnected. Everyone deserves the autonomy of choice. Confronting social injustice can be painful and/or joyful. We are all here because we want to and choose to be. Liberation is possible, and the body doesn't lie. So I'll give another few moments to see if anyone has any questions on any of these, or if there's anything that folks would want to add or to change. I think everything's good. I will say that one that I always want to go back to is that, and that we've received questions about in the past, is the body doesn't lie. And it is just a way for us to ground ourselves in the fact that the body is one of the most honest communication methods that we have as individuals. And sometimes in languages that may or may not be our own, we can't find the words or don't have the words to explain what we're feeling, how we're reacting, how things are landing for us. And so the body doesn't lie honors the fact that sometimes something may not sit well or may sit really well in your body, and your body might find a way to communicate that in a way that you aren't able to communicate to the group. And so sometimes that in itself, sometimes it can just be, this isn't sitting well with me, or I'm not feeling great about this, or something just simple as communicating just that this doesn't feel good in the body, or this does feel good in the body, is something, or may feel strange, whatever that may look like. It's just a way for us to come back to the fact that expecting that the only way that someone can communicate their needs or their perspectives or all of those things be through words is not always the most holistic and often not the most decolonial way to engage with each other. And so just an opportunity to reground ourselves. And the other one that I'll go over just for this presentation is dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. I'm very clear on the belief and the understanding that not everyone will feel the benefits of dismantling systems of oppression from which they benefit, such as white supremacy, capitalism, a lot of the ones that we tend to exist in right now. But the idea here is that the goal of dismantling these systems of oppression leads to a benefit that can be felt by everyone by creating more holistic, more interconnected systems that honor the existence of multiple different identities and experiences. Really quickly, who we are and what we do. The ARC Hub is a dedicated coordination secretariat and resource center for the sector. So the work that we do is for the sector, creating spaces, resources, trainings, knowledge sharing events that allow the sector to better understand and integrate into anti-racism and intersectional feminism into the work that we do. We are a 3-person team. So here you have Megan and I, and then we have my co-lead, who is Barbara, who is our program coordinator. We work from an organizational and an individual level, and from the belief that in a racist society, it's not enough to be non-racist, but to be anti-racist. So the idea that anti-racism is an active work, it is something that is directly confronting, dismantling systems of anti-Blackness, of anti-race, of racism. and making sure that working towards their eradication in our society, in our systems, in our institutions. So to start the presentation, throwing this quote that if it doesn't make sense here will hopefully make sense a little later. So the idea that the reason people think it's important to be white is that they think it's important not to be Black. So a quote by the incredible James Baldwin, and in just starting to ground us in our understanding of Blackness, and especially in its relation to its co-system, for lack of a better word, which is whiteness. So setting a bit of the context. So what is anti-Blackness? I think a lot of the time it's something that's confounded with anti-racism, or sometimes we don't understand why we're bringing up anti-Blackness and not just sticking to anti-racism. But anti-Black racism or anti-Blackness can be seen as the policies and practices rooted in institutions such as education, healthcare, justice, that really work to ingrain, to put into the foundations of our systems and institutions, prejudice, attitudes, beliefs, stereotyping and discrimination towards people of Black and African descent. It really is something that works to devalue Blackness in all contexts. So across all of these systems, in all the ways that you engage in these systems and learn from these systems, the idea is that it really devalues different aspects of Blackness, different understandings of Blackness as a system. And so the term anti-Black racism was first expressed by Dr. Akua Benjamin, who is a Ryerson social work professor. If you've ever had the chance to hear her speak, an incredible professor, and started out as a term to highlight the unique nature of systemic racism on Black Canadians and Black communities, and the history as well as experiences of slavery and colonization of people of Black African descent in Canada. So understanding that anti-Blackness is not something that we talk about often in Canada. The history of Black folks isn't something that we talk a lot about in Canada. And I think a lot of the time we end up talking about the States, and this was an important moment for Black Canadians in kind of the coining of this term over on our side. To kind of ground us in an understanding that Black folks have had a deep and difficult history here, and that deserves to be acknowledged and needs to be acknowledged for us to be able to even start thinking about how we create different futures. I'm not sure if I saw a hand or if I may be dreaming, but I just want to give an opportunity if someone did put their hand up to ask a question to go ahead.
Yes, please. The question and comment I wanted to put, like the discrimination of African Black Canadians, trade agreements and immigration. See, when you look at the colonial legacy, you know, our ancestors free from slavery, they migrate them back to our countries, which made us today be alive instead of dumping us in the Black Sea. Our ancestors, since then now, like this racism, the barrier, it's really great on the issue of immigration. Like in the system of immigration in Canada, the targets for amount of people coming to the country. And if like the target for, let's assume, say like 100 people coming from different countries, the Black, out of the 100, it's only like 10. And it's really tough. Now, there is a system where even the international students, because like a lot of people coming in to educate wanted to. In Canada, like working they discriminate of not giving them visa. Now, even the international students, they put high rates. So there is something inside the system that's really discriminating Africans, either migrate to work or migrate to schooling. That's something that you need to go inside as a corporate international. We need to go in there and notify to the government saying there is a system underneath that people don't know. While other nationalities, other countries are coming, educating, as long as the color is white like them. So it's something that we needed to consider on the colonial. But as we are going on, let you continue. I have another concern with the international and Canadian corporate organizations. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think a lot of what you said is exactly what it looks like in practice. Anti-Black racism, anti-Blackness, the exclusion of Black folks through systems, through policies. I think immigration is a huge one. It's one that has really shown how the government aims to kind of limit the existence or the participation of Black folks in Canada, in the systems here, in community here, as citizens, um, as we know about the immigration process. So I feel like, no, thank you for sharing. I think what you said shows exactly a lot of the ways, a lot of like the very deep rooted and sometimes hard to see ways that anti-Blackness can show up in our policies and practices, especially through the ways in which the government the government engages with communities. So for this presentation, we'll be doing a look into anti-Blackness in the international cooperation sector. So we're not going to delve into a lot of the topics deeply. As we know, things like the post-World War II era colonial legacies, debates on development paradigms, humanitarian interventions, critiques and challenges are things we may touch on, but obviously those are all things that have very, very complex and long histories and histories that have to be delved deeper into. So these are here to kind of remind us of all of the pieces of our sector as it has developed and the places in which we can see anti-Blackness having been embedded in how we do our work in covert ways. So some of the places that we can sometimes kind of go to look for when we're trying to understand not only a little bit more about how our sector came to be as something that was directly linked to colonial legacies and the effects of colonization and its link to anti-Blackness and creating and in spreading Eurocentric views, Eurocentric ideologies. And so, this is just kind of to remind us that we're going to be looking at this through the international cooperation lens, and that these are some of the places that we'll go through, but always to remember that it is really important for us to be delving deeper into the creation of our sector to better understand the ways that not only just anti-Blackness, anti-racism, generally misogyny, so many of the isms and phobias that exist in and how we think about the creation of our sector and generally marginalization. So foundations of anti-Blackness. So we went over kind of a way to understand anti-Blackness as a definition, as something that kind of exists as a term that you may hear thrown around a lot. But anti-Blackness is also something that we have to understand in how its deep-rooted history has been foundational to a lot of the ways that we see the world today. A lot of the times you'll hear it talked about from colonization and how colonial legacies, so European colonialism, that led a lot of the groundwork for anti-Black attitudes and practices. So the ways in which colonizers exploited Black bodies and resources, and through that practice perpetuated narratives of Black inferiority to justify their actions, and that colonial legacy of understanding the ways in which Black bodies were exploited and the ways in which Black bodies were kind of diminished, to be able to really found a way of thought that allowed for us to understand that it's just normal. This is what's necessary. This is what's right, has been something that, like suggests the term colonial legacy, still to this day has a lot of effects in how we view Blackness, how we view Black folks, and how Black inferiority justifies, still to this day, a lot of the ways in which we act, a lot of the ways in which we think, a lot of the ways in which we work. When we think about colonial legacies, obviously we also think about the transatlantic slave trade, and so the commodification of Black lives, of Black bodies, which really ingrained some racial hierarchies. The idea of obviously Black folks being like very little and inferior, and then kind of white folks being at the top and being able to commodify Black bodies. So this trade route facilitated the forced migration of millions of Africans, as we know. And again, much like colonial legacies, really fostered dehumanization and racialized oppression. And so kind of ingrained in us an understanding that Black inferiority is just what is. And so made way for a lot of practices and different types of oppression that would last and be, again, ingrained in our ways of being. And when we think about those processes, when we think then about things like institutional racism, which are the institutions that have emerged from colonial legacies. So that has to do with our economic systems, our political systems, our educational systems, our social systems. So many of the systems that we operate from and in on a day-to-day, the colonial legacies of Black inferiority and the ways in which we've justified the commodification of Black lives has been ingrained in those institutions. So it's how you're taught, it's how you engage in community, it's how you see folks, it's so much of our day-to-day. And a lot of the time it's when we're thinking about things that we have to unlearn, it's the pieces that we don't first see because it is institutional. The idea is that it's ingrained in your way of being in a way where you just navigate from the belief that this is right. And so they were these systems, because they were created from colonial legacies that were informed also obviously from the transatlantic slave trade that had created and ingrained these racial hierarchies. These systems that came out of those colonial legacies really were created to uphold whiteness, to advantage white populations, and while continuing to hold on to the idea that Black inferiority would justify being able to create these systems that really prioritized and supported and created safe spaces and advanced white communities off of the disenfranchisement and commodification of Black bodies. Obviously, to support these institutions and the institutionalization of racism, legal structures were created. So one of the things that you'll hear a lot about in conversations about anti-Blackness is the way in which laws systematically disadvantage Black communities. So again, legal structures that were created and established from the time of colonial rule really institutionalized anti-Blackness through discriminatory laws and practices. And these structures denied and continue to deny Black individuals basic rights and protections and reinforce systems of racial oppression. So a lot of how we function in punitive societies. So we understand that we live in a punitive society. So we are taught to act in a way that stops us from being punished. So the law is kind of our foundation, and we do things to kind of remain morally upright by what the law outlines. And the law being, and these legal structures being something that came out of colonial legacies, essentially create this structure that continues to perpetuate a lot of the systems that we exist in that continue to disenfranchise Black communities. So we know that prisons are places where we will see disproportional amounts of Black folks because of the ways in which laws are created and demonize and target Black communities. And we'll see systems and institutions created around these legal structures that kind of feed Black bodies, Black people, Black communities into institutionalization and in institutions through these legal structures. So when we were talking about the transatlantic slave trade, we talked a little bit about the fact that this ingrained racial hierarchies, and these racial hierarchies that perpetuate anti-Blackness are kind of the idea that Black people exist at the bottom, white people exist at the top, and then everywhere in between there are other racialized communities, other communities that kind of exist between that, through that understanding that the Blacker you are, or the closer you are to Blackness, the worse off you are, or the more bad you are, and then the closer to whiteness you are, the better you are. And so racial hierarchies are also where you'll hear, when we're talking about racial hierarchies, a lot of what you might recognize is conversations around colorism. And so again, the idea that the closer you are to whiteness, the safer you are, the more right you are, the more access to privilege you have, the more I think the way society supports us is kind of the better that you are, and the closer you are to Blackness throughout communities. So understanding that colorism isn't just about Black and white. We know that in other racialized communities, the darker that you are, the worse off you are, through different caste systems, through different religious beliefs, through different spiritualities. This has been ingrained through colonization to be something that exists as a belief throughout communities. And so the racial hierarchies, again, really reinforce the notion that Blackness is at the bottom, and that Black folks are inferior and kind of a lot of the time subhuman. And so racial hierarchies have always been a really dangerous way of perpetuating anti-Blackness throughout all communities. And sometimes you'll hear about the fact that Black folks are kind of at the bottom in all communities and are the only community that throughout the world are kind of equally targeted. And so these racial hierarchies have been really important in sustaining institutional racism, in continuing colonial legacies, and justifying the legal structures that really perpetuate and support anti-Blackness. We also have cultural hegemony. That word is always a hard one for me, so I really hope that I didn't embarrass myself. But the idea that Eurocentric ideologies that were propagated through colonial educational systems and cultural norms that were reinforced, that reinforced anti-Black sentiments. So again, I think this is just something that exists through the process of understanding Blackness as in being inferior. So Eurocentric ideologies can be anything from when we talk about beauty norms, to who should work where, to who should know what, and what people know or don't. You see Eurocentric ideologies kind of exist through our institutions, our systems, and how we engage with each other in community. And the Black cultures have continued. Oops, I think someone's mic is open. If we could. So sorry. So through the spreading of Eurocentric ideologies, what kind of moved through the world with that process was the denigration of Black cultures. And so really wanting to oppress and suppressed. Our languages, our histories completely erased, our traditions completely erased, and really, really deepening our existence in these systems of oppression and further entrenching them in our ways of living and existing as communities across the world. I think, as we'll hear in a lot of marginalized communities, a lot of communities that exist throughout the world, that have been affected by colonization, that one of the biggest ways that we see that process exists is through kind of the erasure of our cultures and our traditions, our languages. I have a lot of conversations with my parents who are from Central and West Africa. And talk about how a lot of, for example, I was having a conversation with my mom not long ago, and she was talking about how less and less communities around where she's from in Niger, in the desert around Niger, and the one that Niger exists in, are practicing body markings and a lot of the visible ways that their traditions existed because of the hope of existing in the globalized world and being able to come to the West, and the ways in which practicing your tradition automatically others you in a way that stifles your growth, your ability to participate in community, and often can have effects on your life. Like, we know a lot of the legal structures that exist really off of sometimes just the way that folks look. They exist in stereotyping, like Black folks with tattoos, the angry Black person, the scary Black person. And so a lot of the ways that even folks in other communities back home are being raised, and to see the globalized world through colonial legacies, through institutionalized racism, is that a lot of their traditions and their cultures, which are being erased through the ways in which we are globalized, and in the ways that the Eurocentric system, like, I don't want to call it not the majority system, but I guess the system in power, the Eurocentric system in power, the white supremacist system in power, the system of whiteness, kind of dictates what is and isn't going to work, kind of tells them what is and isn't going to work. And a lot of the time, that is a lot of the pieces that are linked to their tradition and their histories. And then economic exploitation, I think, is something that we have all talked about, heard about, learned about in our sector. So the way in which systems built on the exploitation of Black labor and resources reinforced anti-Blackness. So right now, especially as we talk about what's happening in the Congo, we talk about the extraction of wealth to the Western world. Really using a lot of the wealth of the continent to enrich European nations, while impoverishing the communities that are giving their lives to exist in that process, just are giving their lives. I don't want to say exist in that process, because they're not doing it to exist in the process of enriching European nations, but a lot of the time that's their only mode of survival in their home countries, because of how much Western nations own the main methods of gaining an income in their home nations, and the land, and a lot of different ways in which they're able to navigate their home countries. And that, as we know, perpetuates cycles of poverty, and has really long-lasting and dire effects. So impacts and consequences. So anti-Blackness, I mean, we can understand it as having a lot of impacts and consequences. It's more than just socioeconomic inequities and psychological trauma. We have to look at it from an intersectional perspective, from a global perspective, from cultural, psychosocial perspectives of anti-Blackness. And in international cooperation, I think just like in any other space, it's really important to dismantling the systems of inequity, and really being able to foster solidarity in real and intentional ways, if we are working towards advancing equity and inclusive development practices. So when we talk about socioeconomic inequities, we talk about the ways in which Black folks are often or do often have less access to education, to healthcare, to economic opportunities. And that creates a cycle, like we were just talking about, of poverty, of social exclusion. And it really creates a history. So a lot of the time we talk about segregation as something that has ended and is a thing of the past, but in the ways in which socioeconomic equities exist in the Black community, there is still a separation, there is still a segregation that exists between Black communities and other communities that are given the ability to have full citizenship. And when I say full citizenship, I don't mean in the procedural way of which we get citizenship, but I mean in the way that we exist in our societies, in our systems, as people who have access to the different avenues and parts of our institutions and systems. Um, and for the psychological trauma side of things, we have heard for multiple years about intergenerational trauma, of the ways in which anti-Blackness and its history and its current existence has effects on the body of the on people's bodies, on people's genetic makeups, to the level that it's passed down to from generation to generation. Newer studies are talking about the ways in which anti-Blackness and racism generally affect life expectancy. Um, so yeah, the psychological toll of anti-Blackness is really profound. I think a lot of the time it's something that's really diminished. We live in a society, because of the ways in which we've been conditioned to just understand that Black folks, to a certain extent, exist a certain way. It is really easy, and we find ourselves really easily diminishing the effects of anti-Blackness, of racism on Black folks. But it's always really important to remember that any type of marginalization, especially one that has effects on your ability to be seen as human, is going to have effects that are deeper than just sometimes emotional. And not to diminish emotional trauma at all, it is a part of how it affects us on a genetic level. But I think in working with youth and working across different sectors, something that has been really constant is the ways in which anti-Blackness and racism are just kind of pushed to the side or understood as being bad, but not really something that's worth urgent action. And I think that right now is like one of the manifestations of how much we've been conditioned to see these things as normal, being able to watch young African kids, young Congolese children in mines who are losing their lives, mining at the age of 6, 7, 8, for us to be able to have access to our phones, to our iPads, to our computers, and watching that and not feeling um, the how deeply disturbing and wrong that is a part of how we exist in the systems. It's a part of how we've been conditioned. The feeling of not needing to act urgently or to collectively come together as a community across races, across cultures, across um, so many of the barriers and lines that are kind of drawn in our society to uphold these systems of oppression is because of the way in which we've been conditioned. But I think it's always important for us to remember that these things have really deep, really profound psychological effects, and that trauma is something that we have to remember is long lasting. It exists past a certain job, it exists past a certain moment, it exists past a certain interaction. It's something that exists really, really long term. I like to bring up things like sometimes we'll talk about micro and macro aggressions. And I think that sometimes these are moments where we have to think about the fact that there isn't really such thing as a microaggression. A microaggression still is a way of reminding that someone is less human or is othered, and that has really long lasting effects for a person, especially if it's happening over and over again in a way that's being perpetuated because of the understanding that it is micro, it is less than, is it as bad? So anti-Blackness is in international development. So legacies of development. So we kind of, there are obviously, as we saw at the beginning, a lot of places that we can talk about and think about anti-Blackness in international development. These are just some of the ways that we see it. So again, places that people can kind of delve deeper into. I always feel like I have much more time than I do, but I will try to rush through the rest of the presentation. Uh, right, development paradigms that were established early on in the creation of our sector were obviously rooted in Eurocentric ideologies, and they reinforced anti-Black narratives into the work that we do, into the creation of our sector, which was carried through its history. They really sidelined Black voices and Black interests in global development agendas. We see that through modernization theory, dependency theory. We see that in structural adjustment programs and neoliberal policies and so many other parts of our deep, long history. And one of the really clear and loud ways that we see it are in humanitarian interventions. Right now, you will hear a lot about how disproportionate humanitarian intervention, humanitarian aid efforts are when it comes to specifically Black countries who are in situations of crisis. Right now, the example that's often given is obviously the Ukraine crisis versus crises like the one in Sudan and Congo, in so many parts of the Black world globally. And a lot of the time it's where we think about the fact that often we think about humanitarian intervention as being really neutral. But it's important for us to remember that neutrality is something that when it exists in a system is going to default to the system's kind of code or structure. We exist in an inherently anti-Black system, so neutrality will allow for the perpetuating of anti-Blackness. So we see that often in the ways in which Black communities are overlooked, underserved, are exploited in situations of humanitarian intervention, further marginalized. And it just reminds us again that anti-Blackness is really ingrained within the international cooperation sector, and even in what we often purport as being very good and neutral work. And I think that sometimes it's important, especially I find that when I'm in spaces that are in international development spaces or in good work spaces, quote unquote, a lot of the time it's really hard for us to conceptualize how we can be buying into so easily systems of oppression. And I think that it is really important for us to remember that, again, I really subscribe to the belief as a anti-racism, as an EDI educator, facilitator, and support person, that we, for the most part, are all going to have some sort of racist ideologies, ideology. And I think that it's important for us to remember that just because we are helping folks and we are working under the banner of helping folks doesn't mean that we're immune from the pervasive influence of systems like anti-Blackness, of ableism, of homophobia, transphobia, of xenophobia, of so many of the systems of oppression that are ingrained in our way of understanding how we engage with each other as people in this colonized world. And so it's always really important for us not to be trying to first distance ourselves from the ideas of doing bad without understanding that, really understanding what doing good means, and also remembering that at the end of the day, we live in a system, we live in a world, we live through institutions that have conditioned us to buy into their existence. And through that, even good work sometimes can be perpetuating bad work. So contemporary manifestations of anti-Blackness in our sector. So I think a lot of the times, I mean, these are, we'll say contemporary. I think that they, in some ways, have existed all along, and these are things that have been talked about for a really long time. I know that the people who trained me and who taught me and who kind of breathe life into my anti-racist and liberation-focused mind had been repeating these things, and they're well into their 60s and 70s and some 80s. And so I think that we can all say that this is nothing new. But structural racism, so one of the ways that we see it, structural racism, so again, manifests itself in policies and practice and power dynamics that systematically disadvantage Black individuals and communities. And so I always like to remind, and I know that I'm saying this maybe for the 100th time, but to remember that when we talk about manifestation in policies and practices, and especially in power dynamics, it's important for us not to think that it's necessarily always going to be something that's written out as like, this is a anti-Black policy. And through conversations that I've had, a lot of time, that's kind of the expectation. We have to remember that it's in the ways in which they're formulated. It's in what they are saying just as much as what they're not saying. And then it's in us understanding how our structures have been built. So from the beginning, knowing that a lot of the time through statistics, Black children aren't even supposed to come into the world based off of the health system. It's really luck and chance that Black children, Black mothers, Black birthing parents are really able to bring Black children into this world by how we have created and sustained the health system. And then we think about the educational system, and then we already think, before even the educational system, we think about the legal structures that take Black children away from their families and institutionalize them through the child welfare system that has been shown to be really detrimental to their development and through their survival. But if they do make it to the educational system, we think about how the educational system ingrains ideas of anti-Blackness and teaches us a lot of these colonial legacies, and really supports these institutions that highlight, support, and put forward and kind of uphold whiteness. So those are just some of the ways that we have to remember that the manifestation of anti-Blackness exists in so much of how we exist every single day, that it's not always going to be clear. It's what they're saying on kids' TV shows. It's what they're saying or not saying in children's books. It's the type of marketing that you're seeing on the ads. Well, I mean, I don't know how many people are still seeing ads on TV, but if you are, the ads on TV or in the grocery store, it's even the design of groceries. There's so many aspects that are perpetuating these systems, that it's important for us not to think that we are always aware of the ways in which they're being ingrained in our way of living and working and being. So those examples continue with hiring practices that perpetuate racial biases. We had to create a whole system of affirmative action to even start seeing higher numbers of Black folks in workplaces. And even then, we know now that they were coming into workplaces that were hard to survive, hard to navigate, hard to move up in, and often would end up having to leave. And in some places, we're seeing affirmative action being taken away, and we're seeing those numbers drop. But already, even before that, we weren't seeing a lot of the quote unquote quotas even being met with systems like that one. In our sector, we see in our programmatic decisions what projects, what communities are being supported, how are they being supported, are Black-led initiatives being supported, and how all of that kind of reinforces inequities and perpetuates anti-Black narratives. And in how we make our programmatic decisions, kind of the ways in which a lot of that decision making perpetuates anti-Black narratives. Tokenism and representation. So often We see Black voices, Black identity, Black experiences really tokenized, really reduced to just checking a box. We worked with that community, or we talked to that one person, or we had that expert, and that's all that we need. Rather than actively really engaging and valuing that connection, that engagement, that relationship building, that co-working relationship. And we always have to remember that tokenism not only fails to address the root causes of anti-Blackness, but also exacerbates feelings of marginalization and erasure within Black communities. So I think that's something that Black folks have talked a lot about, of other racialized community or other marginalized communities have also talked about, of the ways in which a lot of the time, by just seeking out a Black person or a person from a marginalized group, a lot of the time we think we're doing a good thing, but a lot of the time it is really dehumanizing to continue to be seen as just a piece of a process, or a thing to do, or a person to engage with as a means to an end, more so than a person to engage with because we have value and something to bring to these processes and these projects. White saviorism is a huge conversation topic in our sector. So, and something that remains in our sector still to this day. It exists in our narratives, in perpetuating harmful stereotypes and reinforcing paternalistic attitudes towards Black communities. I think it's always really important for us to be grounded in the fact that there is a very dangerous dynamic in believing that we are helping communities that we kind of put in a situation to need our help. White saviorism is a really dangerous dynamic in that way, where we have to remember that colonization, which ingrained whiteness and white supremacy into our systems and institution, now exists as a system that kind of I remember once having a conversation with another facilitator about how international cooperation is a really great marketing strategy, because it brings us into this space of wanting to help and doing everything that we can to help these communities that at the end of the day gave us everything that we have to even be in a situation to help. And now we're living the effects of that process. And we also always have to understand that our sector, in the ways that our sector wants to continue to exist, everyone wants to continue to have jobs. There will always be a line that can't be crossed, because the idea is that if we do all that we can and we do all that needs to be done, then the communities that have resourced the world, the communities that have done so much to enrich Western nations, European nations, all of the nations in power right now, those community, there will be a huge shift that isn't necessarily desired. And so I think white saviorism is something that remains because it must in a white supremacist society, in a society that upholds whiteness, because it has to keep that paternalistic relationship. It has to continue to feed paternalistic understandings, to even, because if we think about it generation to generation, this is something that's being passed down to global communities generation to generation. And those beliefs are changing. Understandings of history, understandings of experience. Projects and initiatives led by white saviors often prioritize their own agendas and interests, further disempowering local Black actors and perpetuating dependency dynamics. So I always like to give the well example. I'm sure we've all heard of. There was the time where we just kept seeing wells being put into communities, and a lot of, especially the women in communities, were talking about how useless that these were, how a lot of the time they were being thrown into places that didn't make sense, and they weren't holding the real conversations that need to be had about how these wells existed in the social dynamics of communities, and how there was a big importance to where they were, and how they were placed, and so much around them that wasn't being considered. But on our side of the world, we were just so happy to be giving and putting wells everywhere, and that was seen as such a savior, or a thing to do, to be saving and helping these communities. Selective solidarity So Black-led organizations and initiatives frequently receive inadequate funding and support compared to their non-Black counterparts, reflecting a systemic bias that prioritizes certain voices and narratives over others. So I think that 2020 really showed us this in terms of the Western world. I think that selective solidarity is something that we see as something that kind of perpetuates tokenism, of kind of when it's convenient, buying into the solidarity movement, and when it's not, it isn't. It's important to realize that to be in solidarity, you have to be able to align your personal goals with the goals of another community. If they're not aligned, there just isn't much space for true and honest solidarity and sustainable solidarity. But in this space, we also see kind of what comes up with humanitarian organizations or a humanitarian intervention coming up again, of the ways in which communities are some communities are highlighted and supported and resourced, while others, very often Black communities, Black-led projects, Black-led organizations, Black communities and countries, are often kind of left behind. Cultural appropriation. So I think this is something that we see often. And I think that sometimes maybe we don't understand the link to our sector, but when cultural appropriation, the idea that cultures and traditions often are commodified and exploited. So this exists outside of the Black community, but when we're talking about specifically Blackness, it's like thinking about Black cultures and traditions that are being exploited and not for the benefit, so exploited as in not for the benefit of Black communities. So from development projects that co-opt traditional practices without meaningful consultation, to marketing campaigns that perpetuate harmful stereotypes, we know that cultural appropriation reinforces power imbalances and perpetuates anti-Black narratives. So imagine just being able to take something from a culture, use it, and kind of keep it pushing, understanding that this is something that has been built over centuries, often decades, and that is so linked to a community's survival and existence. And communities are able to just, for their own profit or benefit, be able to come use it, and without any intention, without any ethic, just kind of be able to make money and go. I think that it's really important for us to realize, even when we're talking about Indigenous communities, we hear a lot about, and we can talk about Black communities also in the conversation about decolonization as communities that were colonized. When we talk about decolonization, and we talk about Black Indigenous communities globally, a lot of the time, because we've lost through colonization the understanding of Black, and specifically, let's say African communities as Indigenous. And when we talk about decolonization, we're throwing this word around, but we're not at all considering the effects. We are not considering the meaning of this work in different communities. And so that's, I think, that is one of the ways that we can think about cultural appropriation, of just throwing things around and using these deeply meaningful practices, terminology, cultural pieces that mean so much to a community, and being able to kind of throw it around without the practice, without the intention that goes behind it. It's important, I think, when I say decolonization, I mean, if I was to even compare what decolonization would look like as someone who's from Niger and Cameroon, if I would compare the decolonization practices that would have to exist and have existed in those two communities, they'd be completely different. There'd be different understandings and requirements of upholding a word like decolonization. And so it's really important for us, when we are taking in different cultures and traditions, especially when we're working with local actors, and to be making sure that we are really holding the intention behind them. So continuing to try to speed through resistance and resilience. So I think it's always important for us to be thinking about the histories. And I mean, this was a very, very quick, very top level overview of pieces of the history. But it's also always, when we talk about communities, marginalized communities, important to talk about resistance and resilience. And for example, in this situation, we have a few examples. So a lot of the time we'll talk about grassroots movements. So grassroots movements exist, obviously, again, throughout multiple different communities and initiatives, but grassroots movements led by Black communities have been at the forefront of resistance, whether it's here or back home. I think it's always really important to remember that communities on the ground, that communities in action, and community in that collective spirit have always been at the forefront of change, of sustainable change, of intentional change. But I think that when we talk about resistance in the international cooperation sector as well, it's important for us to realize that they have been the ones who have gone against even often their governments, who are in partnership often with Western nations to move along initiatives and calls um, uh, through their work. So we can talk about from the civil rights movement in the US to anti-colonial struggles in Africa, in the Caribbean. Um, these movements have challenged oppressive systems and demanded justice and equality. And I think that it's important when we say oppressive systems, these are communities, these are people just like you and I who have chosen to come together to go against armies, to go against governments, to go against systems. When we think about systems, we have to think about the bigness or how huge a system can be. And these grassroots movements have created really long-lasting, important change through confronting those bodies. They've had transformative impacts on amplifying Black voices, on shaping public discourse and advocating for meaningful change. So even when we make reference, for example, to 2020, back to 2020, it's important for us to think about the fact that that became a long-lasting conversation because of grassroots organizers, because of people who demanded change, because of people in community that decided to often, and as we saw, often give their lives. We know that there are people still in prison. We know that there are people who were killed through the process of wanting to amplify the experiences of Black folks in the United States around the conversations that happened in 2020, but the conversations that have been happening about police brutality for years. Community-led initiatives also play a vital role in empowering Black communities to resist anti-Blackness and assert their agency in shaping development agendas. These initiatives prioritize community ownership, self-determination, and collective decision-making processes. I think this is one of the spaces that I've always really loved being a part of. They are the ways in which, as community, we kind of build ecosystems that strengthen us. So from grassroots community initiatives, so sometimes they're educational programs, sometimes they're sports programs, sometimes they're cooking programs, they're food share programs, they're giving people lifts to be able to go to school, to pick up or see their family that's been incarcerated. There are so many grassroots community initiatives that have been instrumental to the survival of Black communities. Economic cooperatives, we know that especially as Black communities globally have navigated the Canadian or the Western international development field of our sector, economic cooperatives and the ways in which people have come together have been really crucial to being able to fund specific projects and communities, and have really demonstrated a really incredible resilience and resourcefulness that Black communities have in the face of systemic barriers. And when I think that's always one of the things that is really impressive is, I mean, these are systemic barriers. These are things that have been put into our systems and institutions to essentially corner Black folks, corner marginalized folks, and folks have decided to come together and build alternatives, build loopholes to ensure that we can survive, that we can continue to exist and to work through these systems and kind of chip away at them while also making sure that we're all good, that we're all resourced, that we're strong and capable to do that work, but also all of the other work that we have to do, whether it is being parents, whether it's going to school, whether it's having a job, whether it's being someone that's sick or caring for someone that's sick. I think that they've been really crucial to our survival. Global solidarity movements. So I think right now we are in a time where global solidarity movements have been crucial to a lot of correction of misinformation, but also in a lot of learning and unlearning, of challenging colonial systems. These movements really have always played a really crucial role in mobilizing support for anti-racist and decolonial struggles around the world. And these movements really connect activists, they connect scholars and organizations across borders to really try and amplify marginalized voices and advocate for systemic change. So we see that with Congo, we see that with Palestine, we see that with so many different spaces that are kind of depending on global solidarity to kind of move the needle, to continue conversations that otherwise would not at all be happening, as we've seen with new understandings of, or old understandings of, how the news kind of shares what's going on in the world, specifically towards marginalized communities. And there's really an importance in building those bridges between local and global struggles against anti-Blackness, because I mean, solidarity, as we see, it's kind of seeing our goals, our movements in others, and building sustainability from that. And we see that in the current context with calls for divestment, for calls for reparations. So specifically with Congo, we'll use the example of folks are talking about divesting from big tech. We don't need to be seeing, we shouldn't need to see kids dying in huge numbers, mothers, so many different members of our communities giving their lives away just so that we can use our phones or have 3 laptops or have all of the newest tech. Black liberation struggles. So Black liberation struggles have a really rich history of resistance against colonialism. I mean, I think that they have a lot of the same power, the same strength, the same processes as grassroots movements. They are often grassroots movements, but have been really instrumental to fighting against colonialism, imperialism, systemic racism, both locally and globally. So we think about the Haitian Revolution, we think about Pan-African movements. These struggles have challenged oppressive structures and asserted the rights and dignity of Black peoples. I think that it's always really, I think in moments like this where I'm kind of in the position of facilitator, that I just think about how much these fights have created a scenario where, you know, I'm even able to learn from our histories, and to be able to share some of what I've learned. Um, Movements such as Afrofuturism and Afro-pessimism offer critical perspectives on the intersection of race and power and resistance in a globalized world. And I think that that's one of the things that Black liberation movements and struggles have really worked to do, is to really, I mean, Afrofuturism and Afro-pessimism both having their sides of the conversations while also being grounded in a lot of similarities. Kind of give us those tools and those reflections to be able to understand our reality, understand our histories, and to build futures that are in line with reality, and kind of challenge those conditionings that we've had over the years. Intersectional approaches. So a lot of these movements and a lot of the Black movements throughout history have worked to recognize the interconnected nature of oppression, and the importance of intersectional approaches in addressing anti-Blackness within the international cooperation, but also within international cooperation, but also other spaces and sectors. So just acknowledging race, obviously, but then gender and class and sexuality and ability and so many of the things that create intersections to in our experiences. So challenging hierarchies, we know that intersectionality, one of the things that it really engages in is understandings of hierarchies and how power and privilege exist in our world. And so intersectional approaches really aim to disrupt dominant narratives that perpetuate anti-Blackness and allow us to better address the diverse needs and realities of Black communities, but also many others' community, while creating sustainability. Often you'll hear people talk about how Black liberation is liberation for all. And I think that it's important for us to understand that because Black folks were kind of placed at the bottom of our systems and as kind of the most inferior, the system of power exists kind of from that space. And so when we think about other systems of marginalization and oppression, like the ones that have to do with sexuality and class and ability and gender, place of origin, religion, and spirituality, we think about them through the legacies of colonialism and how those things were used to build understandings of power through the creation of anti-Blackness. And so we understand that when you disrupt kind of the foundation of marginalization, the foundation of oppression, you kind of make space for different understandings. And considering that we live in a white supremacist system, the disruption of the foundation of that system and knowing that whiteness, white supremacy kind of creates and enforces different types of oppressions, we kind of create a space for being able to build different structures. So, I mean, we have 6 minutes. I really thought that this would be the presentation that I succeeded in having so much more time for questions and answers. But in conclusion, I think that it's always really important for us to be interrogating the colonial roots of anti-Blackness in international cooperation. I think it's important for us to be creating a really pathways to transformative change and really embracing decolonization as an active process, as a process that we have to be educating ourselves about, committing ourselves to. I think in the work that we do in anti-racism, one of the things that we hear often is there's not enough time, there's not enough funding. I think that it is really always really important for us to be grounded in the fact that we live in a world that makes it so normal to kind of see dehumanizing practices as just things that we have to do. There is always a way to be moving the needle forward. There is always somebody, there is always a thing, there's always a process, a support, a resource to be continuing this work. And we are in a space of urgency as we're continuing to see large numbers of Black and racialized death and institutionalization and marginalization. And so I think it is really important to remember that every day that we move through this world, I know it's always, this was a job I was really excited for. And sometimes I have to think about the fact that I spend my days talking about anti-racism and then I spend my days living racism. And so it's always important for us to remember that this isn't something that's isolated, that the people who have to live these legacies and these institutions and these systems and the heaviness of it all are living this on a day-to-day. And so it's always important for us to be celebrating resilience. It's important for us not always to be only talking about the hard stuff without thinking about and learning from and engaging and kind of using all of the lessons from practices of resilience and resistance. It's important for us to all have a call to action, especially as organizations, as people who are working in this sector. What is your call of action? What is your active engagement in anti-racist work and in the liberation of Black folks? Because it is important for us to remember that if we think about international cooperation, that was the idea, and unfortunately that didn't end up being kind of the road that we were on. So what do we do now? And we have to be committed. We have to be committed to change. I think a lot of the time we drop off this road and we think that that's okay, but I think that it is always really important for us to remember that to be able to kind of separate ourselves from this conversation, if we aren't folks who live or experience the effects of these conversations, is a huge privilege. And that while we are taking our step away from this road, there are people who are living the real effects and who don't ever get to step away from this road. And so I think it is really important to remain committed and to find the ways in which, I think a lot of the time when we feel like we have to kind of step off the road, it's because we haven't done enough work to find all of the different avenues, all of the different ways that we can be continuing this work. So it's always important for us to find our avenues and to find the ways that we can keep this work moving forward, because there is always a cost-effective way, a time-effective way, a community-centered way to be doing this work and challenging anti-Blackness in our systems. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll come back to this really quickly at the end, in hopefully 1 minute, but just really quick, things that are coming up at the ARC Hub. So we launched an incubator project that aims to fund 5 sectorial projects. The call for that closes on the 15th. You can find that on our website, our newsletter, our Twitter, and I think our LinkedIn. And so I think it's ARC Hub or Anti-Racist Cooperation Hub on any of them. We'll also send this in an email afterwards. Understanding anti-racism as a framework is another training happening on March 30th. We will be having roundtables for BIPOC staff and leadership coming up in April. And every last Tuesday of the month, we have open office hours. So feel free to come in if you have any questions, and want to talk about anything. And then we always have our newsletters that are going out. We have a resource library if you need extra supports. We have an annual report that came out. Our last year's report is out on our website if you want to read the findings of what anti-racism is looking like, where we're at as a sector. And we have a roster of experts coming soon. So if you folks are looking for supports in the work that you're doing in terms of anti-racism, some folks that can help you move that along. So I know that we are out of time. I am so sorry. One day. But if there is anyone who wanted to, I'm going to stay on for a little bit longer. So if anybody had anything that they wanted to ask about or mention, feel free to do it in the chat. Or if you want to ask it out loud, then also feel free to. But just a huge thank you for letting me ramble on for an hour and a half. And hopefully you got something that you wanted out of it. And hoping to see you again soon, and wishing you the best rest of your day.
Yeah, I want to stick around, and I would like to ask a question for you. Sorry, I don't have. Yeah, I never catch up your name. Always it's ARC.
Oh, no worries. Sorry, my name is Layla.
Lila, okay, yeah. I would like to ask a question. I don't know if someone wants to, but I can stick around, wait.
I think you can go ahead, and then if someone has a question, either we'll put it in the chat or we'll raise their hand.
Yeah, we got the email for the funds for the, yeah. And it says you can apply for 2 projects in one organization. Yeah, because we are registered, we do in Canada in anti-racism, well, included with the homelessness, as you mentioned before. We Africans are more of in the jail and this COVID. So we want to come put them together in a group homes, then mental challenges and other stuff. So we do daily program to take them out of criminal or moving other stuff. And the same time we do international, we register internationally in Sierra Leone under farming, mining, all, and women's against, yeah, with children. So in that, should I apply for the 2 different projects in one organization registered?
I would say that I think the best thing to do for the projects is just to send us an email. The person who's running the incubator is my co-lead, and so Barbara will be able to answer any questions that you have through there.
Yeah, okay. Can I get the email, Aisha? Because like I keep on, I trace the number, but nobody pick up phone. I was really dreaming to join this program today so I can apply right away and send it. That the way
Yeah.
I do my projects.
Yeah, I put it in the chat, the arc
Okay.
at cooperation.ca. Unfortunately, we don't have a phone number. I think that it might have been Cooperation Canada's phone number,
Yeah.
but the ARC Hub doesn't have a phone number. But if you send us an email, we get everything there.
Okay. The phone number. Okay. I mean the email. Let me see. Oh, Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it this fund is under your department, under the
It's a fun,
corporate, or it's abroad?
it's an ARC Hub project, and so the incubator is an ARC Hub project, and so it's funding Canadian-based international cooperation organizations that are working.
Oh, good. That's my dream. I want Canada organizations in West Africa, especially my country. They don't know what Canada doing, and all other corporations, global affairs, they just say, "Oh, America, this is my my advocacy of. Thank you so much." Then I will now know, say, "Oh, this is from Canada." And other people. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, I will send the email as soon as, to get its clarification. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much, Wendy. Je t'entends pas, Megan.